So again, I want to clearly differentiate how hunger is defined and measured differently in developed nations versus underdeveloped nations, starting here in the United States. So for example, when we look at hunger in the United States, essentially it's the inability of a group of people or a person to obtain sufficient food for their household. So that person might do things like skip meals, they might cut back on the quality and quantity of food that they purchase. So for example, they might purchase a store brand instead of a national brand. So going for the Kroger brand of macaroni and cheese instead of the Kraft version. Sometimes these changes are simply a brand change. Other times it's actually a quality decrease in the food that they're consuming. This can also be a recurring or involuntary lack of access to food that can build up malnutrition over time. And generally, when we look at hunger in the U.S., it's in a less severe form than in most developing countries. So thinking back to some of the first slides that you saw the African person lying very emaciated, very skeletal. You typically in the U.S. do not see hunger to that degree. Instead, in the United States, you see hunger. You see a lot more hidden hunger and also a lot more acute hunger. When we look at food security, which is essentially what the United States government should be seeking for all of its people, it's the idea that all people should have access at all times to enough food to live a healthy and active lifestyle. There's also, when we look at food security, establishing such a system so that there's no need for recourse to emergency food sources or other extraordinary coping behaviors to meet basic food needs. What I mean by recourse to emergency food sources is the person will not have to utilize things like the food bank or the social safety nets that would help them in a time of need. And essentially it would be great if we could develop a system of access to food so that people wouldn't have to use those resources to meet their basic food needs. When we look at food insecurity in the United States, it's important to know that there are different levels of food security. When we look at food security, there's high food security, which is the household never answers yes to any of the food insecurity questions. They always have access to food. They always are able to meet all their nutritional needs. And then we have what's called marginal food security. And this term captures families who admit to, at times, that they do have sometimes securing enough food. This might be maybe a wage worker who gets paid at the end of each month. Towards the end of their payment cycle, maybe that last week or the last few days, they might have to eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that week instead of eating healthy meals. So marginal food security means most of the time they're covered, but then there's periods in the month or either the season or the year where their access to food becomes somewhat insecure. When we look and change to food insecurity, this is a lack of access to enough food to fully meet their basic needs. There are also different levels that people exist within this realm as well. When we look at food insecurity, we have low insecurity, which are people that have to make changes in the quality or quantity of their food in order to deal with the limited budget. And then we have very low food security, and then these are people in the category that fairly consistently do not have enough food in their household. They might cut back or skip meals on a frequent basis, both for adults and the children in the household. And this is what we would call a chronic condition. And using chronic is actually aligned with what the UN vocabulary would use to discuss these people within a society. But again, there are discrepancies between how the UN and international organizations like to talk about the hungry poor and how the United States government likes to talk about it. So politicians in this country are much more apt to say people with very low food security than people with chronic food insecurity. So it's very important to note these differences because they affect the programs that people have access to. It affects how the hungry poor are perceived in a society, and also paints a picture of the actual politics and culture around which these people exist. When we look at the poverty level, I want to go through how the U.S. Census Bureau defines poverty, because it's based on the Consumer Price Index. When we look at income thresholds, these are based on the cost of a minimal diet. And the part that's alarming is that these are based on the eating patterns in the 1950s. And if you look back at that period of history, that is just after World War II, and people ate quite differently in the 1950s versus how people eat today. For the good or the bad, that's up for debate, which we can touch upon later. But the way that these numbers are calculated are based on very antiquated data. When you look at the 2009 poverty guidelines for the U.S., they break it down by the number of people living in a family, and for a family of 4, an annual income of $22,050 is defined as as living at poverty level. What's alarming about that is when you look at the percentages of our population that are existing at those levels, which we will do in the next section.